Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to see so many people here at the Royal Society for our lunchtime lecture. This is our last lecture in this spring series of History of Science events, but don't worry, there'll be another excellent series coming up in autumn this year. My name's Felicity Henderson, and I organise the History of Science events here. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Gillian Darley. Gillian is an art historian by training, but has spent many years as a writer and broadcaster. Her book, John Soane, An Accidental Romantic, was published in 1999, and since then she's done further work on Fellows of the Royal Society. She's written a book on John Evelyn, which was published in 2006. And the Royal Society also features in a forthcoming book, which is Vesuvius, the most famous volcano in the world, which is coming out very shortly, less than a month, from Profile Books. And you should listen out for it on BBC Book of the Week in late May. But today Gillian's here to talk to us about Sir John Soane and the learned societies. Thank you, Gillian.
Well, we're starting with an image which is more in tune with our setting than I'd imagined, because I didn't know what form of room we were going to be using. So, a corner of Sir John Soane's library at Lincoln's Inn Fields. And I wanted to really start this idea, this theme of John Soane and his journey and connections with the learned societies, starting backwards in a sense, because this is the house that he willed, that became, by Act of Parliament, a property of the nation, and the culmination of his life's work and his personality and his experiences is this house museum, which I suspect that almost everybody in this room has been to, but perhaps you'll go again for another view, perhaps after this. It brings together really all the strands in Soane's very aspirant life. The trustees of the house were delegated, as per the Act of 1833, to represent the City of London. I think from that you can infer the bank, his greatest job, the Royal Academy, the Royal Society, the Society of Antiquaries, and the Royal Society of Arts. And the wording offered free access 2 days of the week in early summer months to, and I quote, amateurs and students in painting, sculpture, and architecture. The President of the Council of the Royal Academy would appoint curators. And it is really with the Royal Academy that I'm going to, on the Royal Academy, that I'm going to concentrate, although we will also be talking about the other societies, all housed, of course, within Somerset House. Soane was born in 1853, and it only occurred to me when I was putting these notes together that it neatly coincides with the foundation of the British Museum. Not the opening of the British Museum, but the foundation of the British Museum. It wasn't open until 1859. Soane's background, Soane, that is without an E, as it began, is really veiled in obscurity. He was probably an artisan builder's son. That's about as much as we know. We know that his brother was still a hod carrier while Soane was already ascending the professional ranks of architecture. So I put this up for various reasons: hod carrier, ladder upwards, and in fact I think this is a drawing from the Dulwich series, but it does show us an image of the real world from which Soane came, and I think it's also very important because it's a brick wall that we're looking at, and his father was a skilled, this is what we infer, a skilled craftsman in brick, who fell on hard times, so that in fact by the time Soane was in his teens, his life was less promising than it might have seemed at the time of his birth. He was born in the Thames Valley, near Goring-on-Thames, and then moved to Chertsey. This is a portrait thought to be from 1776, and this is the moment, really, where Soane, and I'm telescoping his early years, I'm telescoping his life, really, in order to be able to concentrate on what we're talking about. But this portrait by Honeyman, who was his contemporary and colleague at the Royal Academy Schools, shows him as he was on the brink of his grand tour, as he was the year that he gained his gold medal. And so he'd been at the Royal Academy Schools from 1771. Only the 12th architect to enrol out of 140-odd students, so that, as in all these different societies that we're looking at, he was unusual in the sense of being an architect amongst people of other disciplines. The way in which it worked was that an architect was virtually an extramural student of the Royal Academy. They were required to go to lectures on Monday evenings, and they had access to the library on occasions. So what it really was the moment at which Soane was introduced to sort of the untold riches of the mind, the beginnings of his professional connections, the aspiration to gain a medal, which he did, as I say, a gold medal in 1776, and on top of that, the possibility of a travelling scholarship. The travelling scholarship fell his way, and in early 1778, he left on a grand tour. But he was still the artisan bricklayer's son. He'd had experience particularly with George Dance the Younger, who was his mentor and a constant figure in his life throughout. But he set out as a very unformed person. And the Royal Academy that he had been to, of course, was still lodged in the old royal rooms in the old Somerset House. Just to give you a reminder, the top picture is Kip, seen from the river, and the bottom one is Sandby's watercolour of the garden side of Somerset House, old Somerset House. And of course Sandby was the Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy, so a figure of great influence on Soane. Here is the 1779 Strand view of Somerset House. And this, of course, was the building to which both the Royal Academy, the Royal Society in 1780, and the Society of Antiquaries came to lodge. And in a way, this is a sort of, this was the kind of royal palace of the mind for Soane. His own house was not very far away, and there it was, William Chambers' great mansion of the institutions of state, and Chambers is another figure like Sandby who is kind of crucial to Soane's sense of who he is and where he's going. The lectures, this is a drawing in the British Museum, which is showing the sculpture courses. I think it's by an unknown hand, but it gives you a nice sense of how things worked. I like the aggrandizement of the tutor as opposed to the diminutive figures of the students. Rather the way, in fact, many of the images of Soane's own buildings used to be drawn up to increase the size and scale of them, but in relation to the users and people who were passing through. I put this up as this is the model room shown as it was in the shortly before Soane's own death, but the model room is in a sense the epitome of Soane's grand tour, because I don't need to explain to you that you are looking at models of the Parthenon, you're looking at the temple of Vesta on the first corner of the. Let me show you. Oops. There's my little red dot gone. There we are. Temple of Vesta. And the orders and so on, all in the form of cork models, gathered from about 1805 onwards, but nevertheless redolent for Soane in terms of memory of that tour. And that tour was to be cut short, in fact. He was given a 3-year travelling scholarship, but because of the perfidious Earl Bishop, he was inveigled to come home to Ireland for a wonderful job at Downhill. This is the Earl Bishop of Derry, and Earl Bishop of Bristol, I should say, Bishop of Derry, and as in almost all other cases of patronage for this individual, when he came home, when Soane had come home to Ireland after 6 weeks, he was told that the project was off. And this was a great and terrible blow to Soane's early years. So back from the Grand Tour as a Royal Academy scholarship boy, and left sort of bereft, really, with no jobs and no clear future sketched out. But being Soane, he set about, he had a network of contacts now from his time on the Grand Tour, and he built up, in an astonishing burst of concentrated energy, a country house practice in the early years of the 1780s. I put that in to remind you, really, of what the Royal Academy once housed in Somerset House looked like, and I like this picture because, of course, it's really what you see today. It is a little less peopled with sculpture and a little bit more peopled with people, but this is a shaft of the main entrance to the Royal Academy. So, just again to take this one slightly at a gallop, Soane returns to this country. He builds up a country house practice. He marries Eliza Smith, whose uncle is George Wyatt, not one of the Wyatt builders and architects, but nevertheless a surveyor and builder. And by 1792, they are able to move to Lincoln's Inn Fields. Now, they didn't move, of course, to the house that you see on the screen. They moved to number 12, and for the rest of Soane's life, there was a continual shifting about, reordering, re-envisaging this house. And I think it's important to show it as it was at in his mind at its heyday, and as it is. On the left is a good example, in fact, of the diminutive scale. This is actually Soane and Eliza on the unglazed balcony of number 13, but they hardly come up beyond the sill, because it is, of course, the house that we're looking at, and it's a Gandhi image of his house, because one of the things that Soane learned early on in his connections with the Royal Academy in particular, that it was the way in which you projected the imagery of your architecture to a wider public that was all important. And once he had Gandhi, J.M. Gandhi, as his visualizer, if you like, of his work, he could then he was able to put his work before the public on the walls of the Royal Academy in a most spectacular fashion. On the right is just a nice detail of the house. And I think if you take that image of the front of the house and then you think back to the front of Somerset House, as I showed you, there's a triumphal arch almost everywhere that Soane went, and if he could manage it in his own houses, he was able to draw a parallel, which people could find. And there, of course, is the greatest triumphal arch of his career, I think you could say, which is the Lothbury Court at the Bank. In 1788, so in 1780, Soane had come back to the British Isles, had gone straight to Ireland, and had been rejected. By 1788, that's 8 years later, he is appointed the architect to the Bank of England. I mean, is that not an extraordinary journey at incredible speed? I think it's quite hard to think of anybody who moved further, faster in the professional sphere. And the job at the Bank of England was, I think, without doubt, his greatest work. It was, he kept his appointment from 1788 to 1833. And for the first 20 years, certainly, of that appointment, he was working all the time on different aspects of this site and its work. So it was his great... It was the one job that didn't disappoint. It was the job that allowed him to be everything he wanted to be, hugely important. I put the picture of the Great Hall at the Great Room at the Royal Academy up, just to give you a sense. This, of course, is not where the architectural images were hung, but it is in that sort of setting that the Gandhis of Soane's work had to compete. Therefore, they had to be extraordinarily dramatic. They had to be large. They had to be lit in the most sensational way possible. And this colours, in a way, certainly the way Gandhi sort of placed Soane's architecture in front of the public. But it also, I think, affects the way we see his buildings, because you go around the museum and you see almost everything that he built or hoped to have built through Gandhi's eyes. So we have a very, it's sort of, I always equate it rather to some of the modern movement architects who had very, very skillful photographers at their disposal and could edit what they produced, so that the visual impact was always very honed and very sophisticated. So, 1788, the architect of the Bank of England, many other commissions pouring in. Soane, I think the fascinating thing is that Soane's enormous burden of work was carried by a very, very trusted band of tradesmen who he treated, I think, in many ways better than anybody else in his life, because he knew that when he was working on one side of the country and was already discussing a job on the other side of the country, if he could signal to his plasterer, to his any of his band of tradesmen in a sort of shorthand, do it like you know, do the breakfast room in X house just like we did it in Y house. He didn't have to go to the site and measure and look over their shoulders, because he had complete trust in his team. And this, I think, is where this came from his own background. This gave him a direct line to the way in which a good artisan would work. And I just put up, just for fun really, on the right, the Soanean exterior, which is a curious a plate or two from a book not published until, significantly, not until Soane was dead, in 1840. And this is George Whittick, who was his student and his amanuensis when he was losing his, or thought he was losing his sight in the 1830s. In the 1820s, Whittick was the man who read to him from behind a screen. This is a plate from the Palace of Architecture, subtitled A Romance of Art and History. And it's a rather fond set of descriptions of the way Soane worked, and is, well, we'll see another image from it, another two, but I rather like his kind of compilation of Soanean, almost a caricature of Soane's work, 1840, at a time when, of course, Soane was yesterday's man. The Royal Academy was everything to Soane. He became an ARA in 1795, one of the first 20, one of 20 in that group. In 1796, he became a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. His sponsors, by now he had patrons and clients in pretty much every corner of places of influence, and they included the Duke of Leeds and the Earl of Hardwicke, Hardwicke, of course, being from Wimpole. But being Soane, it wasn't a complete accident that he became a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries at that moment. The following month, the first of a series of papers on Norwich Castle was read to the Fellows by Joseph Banks. It was, in fact, the author of the paper was William Wilkins Sr., a neoclassical architect of Soane's acquaintance, who described what an unnamed architect, but Soane, had done in 1789, using the phrases, a gross mutilation. It had been, the castle, entirely relieved of its antient beauty. He was actually arguing this on antiquarian grounds, or what we might call conservationist grounds. Nevertheless, Soane was exposed before his fellows of the Society of Antiquaries as a wrecker, and Soane didn't take criticism well, and he certainly found that particular episode an extremely painful one. It came at a time when his star was very high, and to be a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, I think, perhaps answered his feeling of needing to have some sort of response. But it is the first of a number of critical episodes that, in a sense, turned Soane very much inwards and gave him a very adversarial view of his fellow professionals and later on the world in general. Having become an ARA at the Royal Academy, which was obviously his alma mater, he was positioning himself to become a full RA, and in 1802 he did so. I'll give you Pitzhanger again, because in 1800 he bought himself a country villa and refaced it with a triumphal arch, as you see, and this was very much part of the campaign, I think you could call it, to become an RA. So he organised a boat outing of a number of his colleagues at the Royal Academy and shipped them over for parties and picnics. And Pitzhanger which was in Ealing, and is in Ealing, was his villa, Thameside villa, not exactly on the Thames, but a place of great elegance and promise. But more than anything else, it was where he was going to train his two increasingly recalcitrant sons to become the second stage in this second plan of his. His own profession was the first plan, his dynastic succession was the second plan. Unfortunately, John Soane Jr. was, while perfectly willing, was not that able, and George Soane had completely different plans. George Soane wanted to be in the theatre. He was a literary man, and he was a badly behaved literary man, perhaps we should say. But whether he was badly behaved before his father started attempting to model him in his own image, I don't know. But Pitzhanger, which is a short incident, but of great importance in Soane's life and view of himself, he began to furiously buy contents for Pitzhanger, and it really is Pitzhanger that kind of sends him into his new life as a man of taste, a man who is buying antiquities, paintings, really furnishing his house as if he had lived there for several centuries. He was also positioning himself to be Professor of Architecture, and this was the other strand of the Royal Academy, the assault on the Royal Academy that he was mounting. Having become a Royal Academician in 1802, as I say, he then watched his mentor and the man for whom he had huge affection, but nevertheless quite an adversarial view, George Dance the Younger, had actually been Professor of Architecture from 1798 to 1806, but he'd failed to give a single lecture. He was supposed to give 6 a year. Why this was, I don't know, but possibly it was the pressure of his very successful professional career. And also, George Dance was as amiable and relaxed as Soane was not. So, in 1806, by whatever means, John Soane is appointed Professor of Architecture. He didn't give his first lecture until 1809, and by which time he'd also bought number 13 Lincoln's Inn Fields. So, in parallel, what I'm trying, in a way, to draw for you is the different stages of his aggrandizement and the way in which his status is building up. And the little sketch to your left shows I think it's a Turner sketch, and it's Mr. Soane, Professor of Architecture, and below is Mr. Flaxman, Professor of Sculpture. Soane and Flaxman were friends, good friends. Mrs. Soane and Mrs. Flaxman were very good friends. Went on holiday together and so on. Mrs. Flaxman described Eliza Soane, who was, by all accounts, an enchanting woman, dancing like a nereid in the waves at Margate. I think we should put that into our view of Margate when we look out over the Turner building. And on the right is the little house at Twickenham that Turner built. And I think it's sort of instructive to look at Sandicombe Lodge, which was Turner's fishing stop, which, without any doubt, Soane has his fingerprints are on it. It has some very interesting Soane features. But look how modest, look what a funny little neat cottage it is. And then remember Pitsanger. Pitsanger by now was to be sold. The sons were proving ever more disappointing in Soane's estimation, and he retrenched. He decided to give up Pitsanger and to put all his efforts into the beautification and the elaboration of numbers 12 and 13 Lincoln's Inn Fields. So that is another sort of key moment in the development. He is giving his lectures at the Royal Academy from 1809 until 1810. Sorry. And then he falls into another of these periodical traps, I suppose you could call them, of his own making. He criticizes in public, in particular, Smirke's Covent Garden Theatre, on account of having a highly formal and correct front, but having bald and completely the side elevations were without any form of classical articulation whatsoever. In fact, they were not to be seen. But the lecture illustrations which Soane was beginning to produce, and I think it's important to remember that in the period between his achieving this lectureship, his professorship, I should say, from 1806 to 1815, the pupils in his office produced 1,000 lecture drawings. And we're talking about lecture drawings, 2 or 3 might fit on this screen. I mean, huge images. And this was, again, another way in which Soane's clever use of imagery was always before him. I mean, these were all the lecture drawings were all put together by students. I mean, it was not his strength, but it was his choice of images. And those of you who know David Watkins' huge book on the subject, many of them are illustrated there. So Smirke's Covent Garden was illustrated, and another building that Soane criticised, again, in both cases, completely breaking a rule which said that no lecture should involve the criticism of a living architect. The other architect he criticised was his old mentor, George Dance, for the Royal College of Surgeons building. Royal College of Surgeons was, of course, directly across Lincoln's Inn Fields from his own house, and it was one of the many buildings one of the many commissions that Soane had assumed would be his. So there is something in there. Along the way, as Soane builds up, Professor of Architecture, okay, so for the 3 years between 1810 and 13, he is, as it were, over the water. He's not lecturing because his knuckles have been wrapped, and he's out of the scene. But he comes back in 1813, and from then on, and for the rest of his life, he delivered these lectures. He was also by then a member of the Royal Institution. 1807 or earlier, he'd become a member of the Royal Institution. And interestingly, while continuing to give his grand lectures and his very heavily intellectualized, I suppose you could say, his lectures were laden with references to his reading and so on. But he also gave lectures at the Royal Institution, only for 2 years, in 1817 and 1820. But the interesting thing was that he gave lectures that were, at that point, considerably more designed for a lay audience, and of course included a female audience as well, which made them a very different audience. Meanwhile, while he is not performing as Professor of Architecture, he's working very hard within Lincoln's Inn Fields. 1812, he remodelled number 13, and he was getting to the point where he was beginning to provide his own descriptions of the changes he was making in the museum. So as he built it, he was also, in a sense, becoming its historian, its chronicler. I put up just to keep the impression of these enormous and wonderful images of his buildings, this fantastic, much later cutaway by Gandhi of the entire bank site, which by this period he had virtually entirely rebuilt. And on the right, the very poignant photograph of it being demolished early in the 20th century. The Soanean interior on the left is from the same publication by George Whittick. I don't know if you can read it fairly clearly. A modest example of that peculiar feeling for linear decoration, etc. But Soane's own description of the breakfast parlour was very insistent that his viewers, his visitors, should accept the fact that it is completely designed to have views out, views down, its multiplicity of mirrors. Of course, he continued to add to this space, but effectively this is the 1812 remodelling. And then he described the variety of outline and general arrangement which present a succession of those fanciful effects which constitute the poetry of architecture. And I think it's interesting because he uses that phrase, fanciful effects, poetry of architecture, in a way that his critics would come to criticize him, for too much fancy, because he wasn't. He was always moving away from the rule book. So the house, in many ways, is already a kind of tutorial. It's It's the house of an autodidact. It's the house of it's an autobiography of an architect. And I think both those strands are very important as you walk round that quite extraordinary set of buildings. In 1815, Eliza Soane dies. There's been a huge crisis in the family. George, ever thus, had written what was known as the death blows, which Soane had was to frame and put in various rooms in the house. But it was an unsigned attack on Soane's architecture, which Eliza Soane had read, and from that Soane inferred fallen into such a terrible state that she was to die. So there's a kind of a terrible interval, really, between 1815 and 1817, where Soane is a completely morose figure. His architectural practice is not what it had been, let's say. And in a way, he's sort of regrouping. And I think it's very interesting that it is really to this idea of his status within the great institutions back at Somerset House that he begins to turn his attention again. But at the same time, he's setting himself up as almost a counter attraction to the libraries of the learned societies, or even aspects of the British Museum. So that you see him in 1821, he's proposed for the Royal Society by a curious mixture of people: Thomas Phillips, the portrait painter; John Rennie, engineer; the secretary of the Royal Institution, as I say, had been lecturing there; an eccentric man called Hatchett, who was a chemist and collector; a barrister; a clergyman. This from Soane, who was the most anti-clerical man you could imagine. Dr. Somerville, who was in fact the husband of Mary Somerville of great fame, and F.A. Spencer, who was the son of the Duke of Marlborough and MP for Oxford. That's typically Soane somehow. He hasn't really left one box unticked in that group. So he's now a Fellow of the Royal Society, and I'm afraid and rather ashamed to say, as I stand in the Royal Society, I can't find very much evidence of his direct connections with the Society, beyond the fact that it was very important for him, obviously, to be able to add FRS to his titles. And at the same time, he's looking more and more at his own house. He's elaborating and collecting. On the right, you've got the library, which now has Greek vases above the library in the alcoves and above the library shelving. The books are the best. He has, for instance, Campo Flegrei, the great William Hamilton volume about Vesuvius, is on the shelves, and 1,000 upon 1,000 of volumes, and he's collecting drawings and so on. And this is to be a place of resort for those who want to find more out about architecture and its correct practice. The British Museum is, of course, growing not many hundred yards away from his house. And to his chagrin, he's now an attached architect, or has been for some time, an attached architect to the Office of Works, but it is not Soane, it is not Nash, but it's young Smirke who gets the job of designing the British Museum, a job he came to regret, I think, but nevertheless, the King's Library, which you see on your left, was a great work, and that would have been somewhere that this image is slightly after Soane's day, but nevertheless it was substantially complete in Soane's lifetime. 1823, young John Soane dies, so the notion of a Soane architectural dynasty is finally, if it was ever even fleetingly to be, it was had come to an end. Soane's legacy was really what he was now, much. I don't use the word very often, and I use it always in a slightly cynical way, but it is extraordinary that Soane's own work, in a sense, led nowhere. He was so idiosyncratic, and his reading of his classical vocabulary was so particular that he doesn't go anywhere. And Wittick, who, this wonderful plate from the same book that you had the Soanean interior and the Soanean exterior, this is the map of the styles. I didn't really walk you through it except to show you Soanean cul-de-sac. This is 1840, and as I pointed out, this was hardly something he would have published in Soane's lifetime. 1823, young John is dead. He buys number 14. He buys Hogarth's election series from Garrick's widow, and the house is further elaborated. The monk's parlour, the extraordinary picture room, the courtyard becoming the monk's yard. In 1825, Soane takes George Dance dies, and Soane steps into his shoes as a trustee of the Royal Academy. And this is the moment at which he gives the great party. In 1825, he gives a 3-day party at Lincoln's Inn Fields to celebrate the purchase of the Belzoni sarcophagus, which he'd bought in 1824, the year before, for £2,000, the price of the entire remainder of Belzoni's collection of Egyptian artefacts, as bought by the British Museum. The British Museum had balked at the Belzoni sarcophagus. And I'll just read to you very quickly. Benjamin Haydon, great diarist, described, on the occasion of the party, described the house. This is now really Lincoln's Inn Fields as it is. A Cretan labyrinth, curious narrow staircases, landing places, balconies, spring doors, and little rooms filled with fragments to the very ceiling. He described people returning with relief to the library for coffee and cake, and to make their necessary thank yous to Sir John. After their hours of wandering about amidst tombs and capitals and shafts and noiseless heads. In 1827, Soane commissioned John Britton, his antiquarian friend, to describe the house and galleries. And this volume was called The Union of Architecture, Sculpture and Painting. And this is what the house was to be. It was to put the arts into a sort of a vortex of objects which would lead you towards a sort of a full sense of the arts. And there, at the very centre of it all, sitting in the wonderful bust by Chantry, at the very centre of this, in the Cretan labyrinth, sits Sir John to this day. He was, the last few years, from the moment at which he'd handed it over by Act of Parliament, which of course was heavily argued against by George, who was still alive and was still working in the theatre. George took the opportunity to visit William Cobbett, of all people, who'd only met him 3 days before, and he found himself on April the 1st, 1833, trying to argue against the move towards vesting the House under Act of Parliament. It wasn't successful, but there was a sort of proviso that if, curiously, after much debate on the 1st of April, the bill was passed, but Peel added a clause which allowed John Soane to divert his collection to the British Museum if he should be so inclined. How wrong they all were. They didn't know what it was for. It was not for the British Museum. It's a very different story. 1833, his house is now enshrined. Royal assent is passed to the 20th of April, and in 1833, due to his advanced age, he resigned from the bank. He spent the next few years, he revised his own description of the house, so the kind of apparatus with which you saw the house was being developed all the time. He was completely in control, and when he died in 1837, the house was there just as it is today. Thank you.